Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. As you said, my name is Curtis Hartenstein. Work for the Non-Point Source program. I'm happy to be here today. I thank you for being here, and I thank you for your time. I know you all have lots of work to do and limited resources to do it with. What I first wanted to start off with today is to point out some of the different perspectives that this panel has presented on. We've heard from nonprofits in terms of the Colorado Rural Water Association. We've heard from water treatment providers. We've heard from water treatment operators. We get a couple of bureaucrats like John and myself up here talking about their source water protection programs and non-point source programs. But I think what we can all agree on is we're all working towards a common vision, and that's the same vision that many of you are in this room are working on. And that is really clean water for all uses. In terms of agriculture, aquatic life, wildlife, recreation, drinking water, I think we all can understand that even though we may get pigeonholed in our own little worlds, we're all working towards a similar goal, a similar objective, and I think the way we're going to get there is to realize that there is compromise and there are ways for us to plan in a cooperative manner so that we can accomplish as many of these goals as we possibly can. The other reality is that there's many challenges ahead of us. Many of us have limited time, small staffs, limited resources. I know my program was cut fairly significantly this year, and I'm sure many of you have experienced similar budget cuts as well, yet you're expected to do more and more with less and less. So with this in mind, John and I and these other panelists and many others in this room have started working together to really understand the similarities, differences, and overlap and mutual benefits that can be achieved through integration of non-point source watershed planning and source water protection planning. Before we get too far into that integration, I want to talk a little bit about the non-point source program. It is operated within the Water Quality Control Division of the Department of Health and Environment. It is a locally driven process. We firmly believe that local people in their watersheds know their waters best. We don't go to people and say, we want you to do a program here. We want you to do an improvement here. We want you to do watershed planning here. Well, we kind of do, but really what we want out of this is for people to come to us and say, hey, non-point source program, we've got a community here that cares about their drinking water, cares about their aquatic life, whatever the concerns or cares may be, and says, Curtis, we've also got some issues, can you help us work through them? And we believe that that's where we work best, in facilitating that kind of arrangement. It is a collaborative arrangement. We get lots of different people to come together to make these projects happen, and it is non-regulatory. So reading those three bullets, you may ask, Curtis, why are you here? What's your value added? Unfortunately, that question is asked a little bit too often for my liking. But anyway, what we do provide is the impetus to help all this happen, our catalyst. And that's funding. We have about $2 million annually that's awarded to us through the EPA to provide for watershed planning, to do implementation projects. Now, that money does have some requirements when it comes to it, but I want to be clear that it's not a loan. This is a grants program. But there is an in-kind or cash match expected, required federally, all across the United States for all these programs. It's important to realize that it does not have to be cash. It can be people's time, people's skills, your buddy with a backhoe, some volunteers cutting willows. So there's many opportunities to provide match so that you can get the cash needed to get the work done in your community. We provide some funding for watershed coordinators. We can help with the human resource aspects of getting these watershed plans complete. The most important aspect that I want you to understand for our program, because I don't want anybody out there submitting or going through an application process and being disappointed at the end, we really need people to really well define the link to water quality. And we do define what that link is within our program, within our ability to fund. And I want to explain that to you just a little bit more. So our program priority is for impaired segments. John brought up the map with all the red on it, showed those 303D listed segments. So those are all water bodies impaired by the state. You know, that impairment says for at least in this basin, for cadmium and zinc, we're exceeding aquatic life standards, and we need to lower those to become back within a tolerance level for those species. Really, our focus for the non-point source program is on those heavy metals. Okay? That's really where we want to see a lot of our work focus, because that's the largest priority within the state in terms of impairment. Secondary to that, we focus on selenium issues. A lot of that in the Colorado River Basin, but that's not unique to this basin as well. So, I'm sorry, it's not uncommon in this basin as well. So we can work with selenium issues anywhere, really. Following that are these next three. We really sediment nutrients. Many of you have heard, been a party to the recent nutrient criteria that's been developed throughout the state that just went through the Water Quality Control Commission process. A lot of that's still being parsed out, still being defined, how that's going to look, but some major decisions have been made. And I think we all can acknowledge that this process will advance to some degree, and what we provide in the non-flowing source program is a way, I feel, for a lot of people to get ahead of the regulatory process and start gaining the information you may need in your communities to help be better informed when and if those regulations come to your watersheds, and you need to be prepared to work within that regulatory format. Other impairments we work with, DO, pH, aquatic life. So really, all these different water quality impairments are available to be restored, corrected in a collaborative manner through the non-point source program. So how are we going to get there? How can we work with that leverage that what I just spoke about? How can we do more with less resources, with less staff time, with less hard cash? Well, I think our concept in the context of this panel and this forum is to work within a couple of different programs that we have in the Water Quality Control Division, and that being source water protection and the non-point source aspect of watershed scale planning and restoration. It all begins with a plan, and I'm sure there's just been a couple exasperated sighs out there. Are you kidding me? Another planning effort? Can't we get to do some work? Yes, we can do some work, and we can do some really good work. We can get machinery on site. We can build better projects. We can mitigate these issues. But we first have to define what the problem is, what we have at our resources, what's available for us, who can we team up together, and that's where the watershed planning process comes in. A little bit of the similarities between the watershed planning process, the non-point source program, and John's program in the SWAP. Similarities, it's all collaborative. We're dealing with a lot of different people to come together. Agency staff, all the different government people, local groups, private citizens, school children, whomever can come and participate and has a voice and a vested interest in their watershed is a part of both of these planning efforts. They both involve that resource inventory. What do we have to work with? What's at our disposal in our own watersheds? What can we build from? Identifying the threats. What are the concerns? And I like to think out there that there's a lot of presumed concerns, and then there's a lot of real concerns. So we work within a process to help define what's a true issue, what is a real scientifically based issue, or what's a perceived issue that we can mitigate through public education and then move forward. The other similarities is both our programs seek at the end of this planning process to get to management options. A watershed planning process, in my opinion, does not go far enough if it does not get to implementation. If it does not spell out what a prioritization of threats are and a priority of treatment for those threats and some means to get to the water quality goals that you may have, I feel it's an incomplete plan, and that's something that John and I share and many of you do as well. So within this watershed planning process, I think it's a lot of front-end work, and the meat is in this last chapter when it says, okay, what can we do about it? A few of the differences between our programs. Scale. Source water protection largely works within a smaller radius. Goes out about 5 miles, John? Is that
15 miles?
15 miles is the extent of the planning radius in a limited sense. Of course, it can go much broader than that, but at a minimum, it goes 15 miles out. Our watersheds can be defined by you. What is the extent of your watershed? Do you have geopolitical boundaries? Is it an aquatic boundary? Is it, is it a watershed boundary? What defines your watershed? Is it a small creek? Is it the whole upper Arkansas River Basin? What might it be? We can work on various scales that meet your needs as a community. The steering committee makeup is another different thing. As we're dealing with a larger scale in terms of non-point source watershed pollution prevention and mitigation, we tend to often have a larger body represented on our steering committee. So we have local governments involved, we have treatment operators, we have fish and wildlife folks, we have Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we've got local watershed groups, we've got private citizens, a lot of whom John works with whom John worked with. We kind of broaden that scale just a little bit larger because we're working with generally some larger areas. And the impact focus can also be different. We're really going to focus on not just the intake, or what we can do potentially at that intake or within the boundary area that's been defined by the 15 miles, we can work at a larger area to determine, okay, is it historic mining that we need to address? Is it some land use practices that we might be able to work with the landowner on? We have a little bit different impact area. So in this process, what we've sought to do is to allow the steering committee, which you see a few of the members here. There's many more that are on the steering committee. There's 2 actually steering committees that represent those 5 treatment operators that we talked about earlier. What I feel my role is in this process is to sit back, to listen to what these treatment operators have to say, what the concerns regarding source water protection are. It's certainly not my area of expertise. I've learned a lot more about it lately. But I want the source water protection folks to come for the plan that they intended. Their focus is the source water protection plan, and that is really where the focus needs to be. It is into a great resource for these communities, and I don't want to burden an additional planning effort on top of that. So what I do expect, and what we have worked with the steering committee to understand, is the watershed planning and non-point source planning roles and responsibilities, kind of the overlap between them two. We want them to communicate with the colleagues, and this is really where you folks come in. This is the message that I'd like to send home with you, is that we can identify local partners once these source water protection plans are done. We can find watershed groups. We can find environmental health officers, whoever the champion may be, to pick up the source water protection plan and say, hey, if we take this one step further, if we broaden our scale a little bit more, if we involve a few more stakeholders and do a little bit more homework here, we can get to a watershed-based plan. And once we get to that watershed-based plan, then we have the tool that allows us to tap into that non-point source funding to get to implementation and restoration, which a lot of us really want to get to. We know what our problems are. We want to solve them. This is the way to get to it. So we also expect our steering committee people to participate as an expert in their field. When and if this does turn into a watershed planning effort, we want the water providers to come back. They've been through this process. We want them to contribute and to provide the expertise that they have. What we don't expect of these guys is to do more. When these guys are doing their work, they're working to get these plans done, to fulfill requirements, to make for a better product in their community. Now it's up to the rest of us in the room to decide, okay, can we take this effort, this solid, strong start, broaden it a little bit more, and get to a greater impact for all of our efforts. This is the website for the Colorado Non-Point Source Program. I encourage you to visit it. I'll be here throughout the afternoon. A colleague of mine, Randy Ristow, Randy, can you put your hand up, please, is also here from the Non-Point Source Program. Please feel free to talk to either one of us about the program, how you can get involved in it, or visit our website. I can pass out some cards. And before I go, I want to make a plug for a couple other programs that I work with. One is the Colorado Data Sharing Network. Many of you may have heard of that. This is an effort that the Non-Point Source Program is involved in to provide a uniform format, mapping tool, common database where people can share data throughout the state of Colorado. Anybody can participate, and the objective there is to share information so we can avoid duplication, so we can make better management decisions and share the data that is costly in terms of dollars and time to collect. There's 2 ways you can participate in that program. You can just get your stations on a map. If you say, hey Curtis, I've got my data organized, I've got analysis tools, I've got maps, I've got GIS, I've got it all covered, I think the minimum that we can expect is let's just share where we're collecting our data. Then the individual that might be interested in gaining access to that information can contact you directly and say, hey, can we share data? Maybe, maybe not. You know, how can we work within the guidelines that we have for sharing data? So we can get you on a map just to show where everybody's working. Might save all of us a little bit of time. Another component is that online database. So for smaller groups who don't have the capacity or are just kind of managing things in Excel spreadsheets, and that can work well to a point. But once you get to a point where it gets a little bit burdensome to manage, I think that's a great time to get into the data sharing network. You can store your data there. We're developing analysis tools so you can compare to state standards. You can see what your maxes, your minimums, your lows, various statistics could be wrapped up in it, and it's all free. So if many of you are strapped for a resource to manage data, because it's often a component of data collection that's left to the end to think about and figure out, it can be challenging at that point, data sharing network's a great way to do it. My last plug before I sit down and you let some of these other people speak is the Colorado Riparian Association. I'm a board member for that organization. We seek to increase and transfer the knowledge of riparian system restoration, safeguarding, and protection. We're all volunteer board. We're a nonprofit organization, and we just share information. We've got people that are from private industry who are restoration ecologists and are out there with the dozers and engineers and building these projects. And people like me from a funding standpoint, at technical components. A lot of different people go into this, so we're a pretty diverse board, all working toward a similar goal. So with that, I thank you again for your time. I'll sit down, and then I believe we're going to open it up to a panel discussion should you have any questions. Thank you very much.